All right, hey guys, it's Jason Sheftel here, and today we're going to talk about the dark little key that is at the center of the whole modern world, basically. We're going to talk about semiconductors. So, semiconductors are basically everything for our modern digital world. You can't have anything without semiconductors. And I've talked about this a little bit, but today we're going to specifically talk about China and how it lacks semiconductors. It lacks its own production of particularly the really high quality advanced semiconductors it needs for all of its high tech ambitions, and what China has done to try and fix this, and how it has really failed, kind of like everybody else. And the core of why is just basically some of the basic economics of the semiconductor industry, which are really brutal and are hitting the United States and Europe and basically everywhere at the same time. So it's not just China, but we're going to use China because it is really, its failures are really instructive for everybody. So first thing to know is that China lacks semiconductors, and that is putting it mildly. So China makes maybe around 17, 18% of the semiconductors that it needs. So it makes, that's the only percentage of all the semiconductors that are used throughout China. 16, 17, 18% are made in China. And this is one of those things where we always think, oh, made in China, everything is made in China. Well, not really. And if you move assembly out, if you move out things that are just assembled in China, not totally made in China, that really decreases. But for really advanced stuff, like semiconductors, China is just as in trouble as, well, a lot of countries in the West. So in another video, I'm going to talk about the green energy supply chain. I'm going to talk about batteries. I'm going to talk about cars. I'm going to talk about electric cars and where this is going and how our global dependence is shifting from some of the fossil fuel regions like oil, or at least hypothetically shifting from the fossil fuel regions like the Middle East and its Saudi Arabian oil and all that, and towards random countries, random also very troubled countries like the Congo, Indonesia, and all sorts of other places. But that is really for a separate episode. That is to talk about the places where China really does have a specific advantage for various reasons in certain industries, high-tech industries, but it's not as durable as people think. But this is something very different. This is a place where China, in semiconductors, China just does not have the manufacturing capacity, the industrial capacity, the technological expertise to even make this stuff. So under Xi Jinping, China has been pushing for technological self-reliance. And one of the key places that it really needs to make this happen is in semiconductors. Because if you want autonomous cars, if you want crazy advanced satellites, if you want crazy advanced AI, if you want basically anything that was in the old Made in China 2025 or any other high-tech industrial policy agenda, you're going to need semiconductors for every single thing. And if you look at where things are going in the, for example, the consumer electronics industry, everything is moving towards advanced chip designs that are made in-house, designed in-house. They're incredibly sophisticated. For example, what Apple is doing, and it's moving throughout the industry. And this is just the absolute cutting edge for all of the applications you're going to need, whether it's computer vision, whether it's really advanced machine learning, whether it's neural nets, all this kind of stuff. This is what you're going to need. So naturally, China's been focused a lot on semiconductors, and it really started kind of in 2014, along with a lot of other things that kind of were set in motion around this time. And China's been investing what looks like big money into this. So, 2014, it put in 22 to 25 billion officially. Often there's way more that goes on various that is thrown out in various ways under the table. And, again, in 2019, China put out $30 billion to try and invest in semiconductor capacity, in new firms, in production lines, in all of the things that it needs to have its own indigenous semiconductor supply chain. And as everybody knows right now with the world and the supply chain problems that we have, semiconductors have been at the core of all sorts of problems. So this was early. China was already trying to invest in all of these things before semiconductor shortages decimated the car industry and basically is forcing them to retool the way that they gather chips, the way that they procure chips, the types of chips they use, the number, the variety, their own in-house or really adjacent design and engineering capacity to do the software programming and to do the hardware design for these chips. All this has been changing, and it's really only reinforced how essential semiconductors are. But let's see what happened with China. So in 2019, it already put in $50 billion into this. It was a very classic China-style investment strategy where it says, hey, this is a new arena. It opens up the floodgates to all sorts of firms that might have the capacity to do this. And then it creates a feeding frenzy where every sort of firm you could imagine tries to get on the game. So it doesn't matter if they make dishwashers. It doesn't matter if they make, heat sinks. It doesn't matter if they've only developed boilers or something in the past. Everybody gets in on this move. This is what happens in space technology. It's what happens in electric vehicles. It's what happens in any sort of industry where this tends to happen in China. And then really, so you get this from this bureaucratic, remember, it's a sort of regulatory thing. The government designates an industry as X and it needs to happen. Then all of the provinces try to get on the action. Everybody wants the new high-tech center of the future. This is kind of the way things go. So you get thousands of random companies in China that all file as semiconductor corporations. So everyone is basically chasing after this gushing stream of money that the government is pushing out. And soon, because of this, everybody always starts talking about how China is going to be the top dog in semiconductors, just like it was in every other industry. And that's kind of the narrative you get because everyone is always so amazed at the scale of investment that China is able to do in a top-down directed fashion at the industries that it considers strategic. And it's had a lot of success for various reasons that I will get into in other videos in some of these industries. Obviously, like phones, whatever. There's a lot of industries that China's done really well. High-speed rail, all sorts of industrial technologies. But that's for a different thing. In this sort of very advanced, very capital intensive, very specific, very challenging and competitive industry, people might have been a little bit premature with this. And so what actually happened is by 2020, 2021, it was very clear that this had become a insane sort of sector. And the regulatory bodies in China were already like, oh God, like we have to start culling the troop here. We have to start, killing off some of these companies that are not semiconductor companies that are they're just going to waste the money that we've invested, et cetera, et cetera. So that was already happening. But in general, besides the regulatory problems of the bad companies, basically one after another, these Chinese semiconductor companies have been going belly up, right? Just 6 major ones have closed in just the last 3 years. And in general, this semiconductor push, which is, at this point, it's 6-7 years old, has not worked out. It has totally failed. And let's talk about why this is. So the basic reason is the economics of the semiconductor industry are brutal. This is an insanely, enormously capital-intensive industry. That's the first thing to know. So single pieces of equipment, a lot of the lithography equipment that you need to start etching things onto the wafers, all that, these pieces of tech can cost over $100 million just for one of them. Just for that, right? And building out production lines costs billions, really billions. And so one recent factory in Taiwan by the manufacturing chip leader in the world, TSMC, that cost $15 billion for the one, they call it a fab, but it's basically a factory, right? Semiconductor fabrication facility, whatever, semiconductor factory, semiconductor, whatever. So we'll just call it a factory, right? That factory costs $15 billion. And the big players spend insane amounts of money, right? So just this year or last year, TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, the 3 big chip manufacturers. And again, there's contract chip manufacturers as a whole. There's many other aspects to what's going on in this industry we're not going to get into today. But the big 3, they are spending $75 billion in just 1 year. So when you look at it, actually, the $50 billion official-ish dollars that China put in over 6-7 years, that's nothing. That is absolutely nothing. It doesn't even scratch the surface it doesn't even get you at the table, let alone into the front, into the front of the pack. It's nothing. And these intense, ridiculous rates, basically ridiculous capital costs, make semiconductors a very hard area to muscle in on it. And it's also a very difficult industry. If you go back over the decades, there's a lot of booms and busts, a lot of things. You have to really predict all sorts of moves. And it's fast moving and tough to get your bearings. And the best example of that right now recently is Intel. Intel, which is one of the big 3, is just fallen behind. It basically missed the whole move to focusing on the really low power, very efficient mobile chips that Apple and other companies have been focusing on for years, really advancing the state of the art in semiconductor design using the yearly Apple and other Android releases every year. All these, this is really, what has moved the chip industry forward. Primarily, there's other stuff, there's other parts of the industry, there's servers and there's graphics chips, and those are all other areas. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, Intel's kind of fallen behind on all this. But the big thing is it lost the key, most dynamic, largest sector that need to focus on, which was the exploding mobile chip part of the semiconductor industry starting around 2008, 2009, 2010. And this is what allowed TSMC to become the biggest player in the world. TSMC and Samsung kind of trade off, with TSMC being the main one of being Apple's sort of contract manufacturer. And so that has been just an absolute disaster for Intel. And it's also completely lost its hold in, I mean, it didn't have a great hold in graphics chips, and it's increasingly being really pressured for the server side chips. And then even on the basic Windows PC, that kind of era, these are really changing. Even Microsoft is looking to do its own chips now, because that's what Apple has been doing. It's really going to push things forward on the laptop side of mobile computing. Basically, you're having the stuff that was put in phones and tablets is moving to laptops and increasingly to desktops. And we'll see how it works on desktops. But with laptops, it's going to be massively transformative, and it's going to require a lot of Windows laptop manufacturers or Chromebooks or whatever, Apple competitors, Mac competitors, to move in that direction. And that moves them away from Intel. So Intel's basically, in the last year, it's basically put out a massive plan to reconfigure itself to become, in part, a contract chip manufacturer like Samsung, like TSMC. It won't only do its own chips now. It's not only going to design and manufacture its own chips. It's going to also let other people design them and build it for them, right? That's the strategy that really worked for the other guys. But even all this stuff, Intel's already still one of the big three, but even just trying to maintain its lead or get back into the top rungs is brutal. It's going to take this company, which is already there, like 5 years. So all these really no-name, unknown Chinese semiconductor companies, they're really going to struggle. And in general, like I was saying, this industry is so fast-moving. There's new developments every year, and you have to keep putting out this money. So it's really hard to find a customer base for old chips by unproven manufacturers, right? There's a hierarchy in the semiconductor industry where you have really high-end stuff is done by the TSMC, the Intel, the Samsungs, and there's sort of mid-scale chips that aren't really done in Taiwan or South Korea, and they're done more in, say, Thailand. And then there's even lower-level chips which are done in more places, and that's sort of it. But if you want to really move into the absolute upper rungs, you really need the best. You really need great equipment. I mean, you really need great semiconductors, and you need customers, and you have to know that these production lines are going to be used basically at 100%, right? That's the way it works. If you spend $15 billion on a factory and it's used 20% of the time, you lose so much money, you can't do this. And so in China, there are ways to try and make this work. If you want to do full-scale industrial policy, I mean, you could force Chinese phone manufacturers to try and use this and do this kind of stuff. But the problem is, what do you do if the rest of the world is charging forward? Again, China wants technological self-reliance. It needs to be on the advanced cutting edge of many, many industries that require, as the input, all these semiconductors. So if it's going to stall all these industries to wait for its semiconductor capacity to be there, to let it do what it needs to do, it's never going to make it. And basically, it's just going to fall behind. So this is the kind of the chicken and the egg challenge here for China. It's like, well, we need the semiconductors, but we can't. What are we supposed to do? We only make less than 20% of the semiconductors we need. We can't just force everybody to use the ones we still don't have enough, right? You don't even have the capacity to move everybody onto these. So that's the challenge, right? You basically, what these Chinese companies end up doing is just a lot of R&D, and they don't ever really get into a production, massive, large-scale production, which is what you really need to do in this industry, because that is also where you learn how to make things better. This is where the Moore's Law, part of Moore's Law, wasn't these theoretical improvements. It was like you had the next production line set up, and you found improvements as you did it. It was a part of the production process. I mean, this is sort of the nuts and bolts history of a lot of this. You don't get it in a theoretical world. You actually have to do that production. You have to you have to use those learning curves. You have to get everything out of the actual process. If you don't scale up the manufacturing and find the improvements, you just can't improve. And so that's really a challenge that China has been facing. And it just has a complete lack of expertise in this, right? And it's not like China. Like, China has all sorts of expertise in a lot of technical areas, but this is really concentrated, right? And ironically and unfortunately for China, Taiwan is the place that is the most advanced sort of semiconductor place on Earth. And that's just the truth of it. And it's kind of hard for China to say it, really, at least for the last many decades. It's been very hard for China to say, or Chinese companies to say, oh, we need this here, we need this there, when you could just get all the stuff you need from Taiwan. It's actually been very advantageous for China, for Taiwan to be the place that you can get all these semiconductors. There's many reasons why this is good, but it's also obviously very bad when you have problems with Taiwan, when you have potential military conflicts, when you have all this stuff that could happen, and when you just need, you really, really want these semiconductors to be your own, right? Unfortunately, if you go invade Taiwan, that ain't gonna work, right? You can't sort of force everybody to run these factories. That's not gonna work. You actually need the industry intact. If you go through a war, you're gonna destroy the industry. So that's also another problem. And China's tried a lot. It's tried to hire and poach all sorts of talent over from Taiwan. And you'd think this would work, but again, you need these production runs. You need to actually be in the game and really doing it. You can't just be doing R&D. That's for universities. So it's been tough. And ultimately, it's not just China. 98% of countries have this problem. The United States has had this problem. I mean, it used to make, 60% of really high-end chips in the 90s. And as in many other industries, this has just collapsed. It's plummeted. It was globalized. It was sent around the world. And then, again, in this sort of industry, it can be very hard to recapture these leads, right? We'll see how well Intel does. Most likely, it can sort of work, and it really might be able to play off the geopolitical tensions, which is something, right? You could say, oh, we need this stuff for the United States because of all these supply chain problems and the problems in China, and what if X happens, what if there's a war in Taiwan, and blah, blah, blah. That's really important. And I will most likely talk about what that would look like, not just the war itself. I have a whole thing about war in Taiwan and what that will be for later, but just the aspect of semiconductors. I mean, this is a big reason why nobody really wants a war there, and nobody's really talking about it. But if you lost Taiwan, let's just say that the ability for the world to function as we kind of know it with semiconductors would be really, really, really limited. But that's for another video. Right now, we just got to get back to the fact that China's attempt to create an insanely technologically sophisticated industry, semiconductor industry, in just a few years, didn't actually work. And it didn't work at all. And you can't make it work just because the government wants it and is paying. And especially not in this industry where this is where it really shows that China's supposed to have all this money. It's supposed to, everyone assumes that it has endless money to throw at all these problems. But that is long past. And the actual capital cost of even trying to move away from semiconductor dependence, really, to 5x China's capacity. I mean, this is probably hundreds of billions of dollars. And you have no idea if it's going to work. And you also most likely would end up with inferior chips and technologies. And this is the absolute bottom line, right? If China tried to do this, if it tried to really have its own chip sector that was just, it really decided it needed independence above everything else, and it had to kind of make its own thing, well, it would quickly be a decade behind everybody else. That's just the core unfortunate fact of it. So the truth is, China's tech dependence on semiconductors, its dependence on imports for these key chips, the great, necessary, essential, fundamental input of the modern digital world, is going to almost certainly get worse. If this round or this last round of investments didn't work, well, the next one isn't going to work either. And just salvaging something from all of this wreckage of semiconductor companies in China is going to take a lot of work. Like I said, in the semiconductor industry, you have to produce to improve. And many of the companies that China invested in, dozens of these companies, they didn't manufacture a single chip. So the bottom line on this is that China got burnt really hard. And the government will probably, in this area, hesitate to actually throw even more money after bad money, just because the wreckage is pretty severe, but its dependence is also so terrible and galling, and the Taiwan element is brutal, and the obvious semiconductor shortage in the world is brutal. And all this makes it feel like it's even more important than ever to have a semiconductor industry that is indigenous and Chinese and can be used in any sort of conflict or problems that China would have with the rest of the world that might cut it off. So maybe we'll throw some more money after it. Maybe it won't. Kind of hard to know, but you do know after listening to this basically how it's almost certainly going to go, and it's not going to go well. China's hope of having its own indigenous semiconductor industry this decade is just dreams. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. And if you liked it, please like it so more people can see it. And as always, if you've seen a bunch of videos, think of subscribing, hit the notification button so you don't miss any more videos. And with that, I'm Jason Sheftel again, and I'll see you